Good evening, everyone. This is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the movie Resurrection on Blu-ray. So Resurrection came out in 1999 and it was directed by Russell Mulcahy and it starred Christopher Lambert. And this was the third collaboration between the two, the prior two collaborations having been Highlander and Highlander 2. But the way that this movie came to be is a rather interesting story. So, Mulcahy and Lambert had met up with screenwriter Brad Mirman to collaborate on and develop another movie entirely. But that ended up being thrown by the wayside because they also had a germ of another movie in mind, which was basically a serial killer thriller. And they found themselves repeatedly coming back to that movie in the midst of their conversation for the movie that they had originally, met up to discuss. And so somewhere along the way, that movie was tossed aside and all the focus and interest was put on the story that would eventually become the movie Resurrection. And so another interesting little tidbit is that the story for the movie is actually credited to Christopher Lambert and the screenwriter Brad Mirman, although Brad Mirman did the actual script. But it is interesting when one of the lead actors for a movie is one of the forces behind bringing a story to life, and instead of say just acting. So I always thought that was an interesting little tidbit there. But the movie, if I remember correctly, wasn't released theatrically stateside, but was rather released on cable like HBO and what have you. And it may have been released theatrically in other territories, but I do vaguely remember seeing it listed on cable when it first came out, because I was significantly younger then, but I remember I was at a hotel and there was some sort of family get together or what have you, and when you're in a hotel and you see that there's all these movies and stuff on cable, you're looking around and at the listings and descriptions and what have you, and it had a list of new movies, right? And so I remember that Resurrection was one of those new movies, and it was saying that it was from the director of Highlander and also starring the lead actor from Highlander, Christopher Lambert. I'm like, oh, cool, because of course I recognized him from Highlander, but also I was thinking Raiden from Mortal Kombat, but unfortunately, because it was rated MA for mature, I was too young to watch it, so I missed out on the movie when it first came out. But I did eventually rent it on. I rented the DVD at Blockbuster when it was still around, and I remember that I liked the movie, but in some ways I was kind of disappointed in it because there were it wasn't a bad movie at all, but at the same time, it could have been so much better, But fast forward, several years later, when I'm doing reviews and I'm on a bit of a Russell Mulcahy kick, and I figured, okay, this was this is one of his, more, I guess you could say, well-known movies, at least in certain circles, and plus the fact that it was another collaboration between him and Christopher Lambert, and so I was able to. A while back, I was able to get, the Blu-ray, right? And I gotta say, the Blu-ray release is actually a pretty good one. Vinegar Syndrome, they put it out in 2021, and, the film quality is good, and there's a nice, set of special features. So they did a nice job with this movie. The only downside I could think of as far as the special features go is that it's lacking the director's commentary that was on the DVD. I don't know why they left that off, but it would have been nice had that been ported over. But as it is, the special features that are on here are pretty good. But the movie, let's go ahead and get into the actual story here. So. The story kicks off in the city of Chicago, where there's a serial killer, going around gruesomely murdering people, and his modus operandi is, taking a body part from his victims. And sometimes it's an arm, sometimes it's a leg, sometimes it's a head, sometimes it's like a whole, torso. Really sick bastard, right? And he's leaving, messages in blood, and sometimes the messages will say he is coming, but there are other messages which seem to be some sort of numerical codes. And in working on this case are detectives John Prudhomme, played by Christopher Lambert, and Andrew Hollinsworth, played by Leland Orser. And the two of them have worked together for a while, and to a point where, say, they've had they've had each other over, with their families and what have you, and they have a good rapport with one another, and they're very different in terms of personalities. Prudhomme is more serious and, I guess you could say, focused on the job, but he also has kind of a tragic background in the sense that he and his wife recently lost their son due to a traffic accident. So he's got that weighing on him. And Hollinsworth, on the other hand, though, is more of a laid back joker, and so I mean he's constantly trying to liven things up, bring a little bit of levity to the job. And there's kind of a running gag with his character in the sense that he's constantly making these really bad jokes, and so it's kind of a thing with him, but the two of them, I mean, they've got a good working rapport with one another, but when they get this case, I mean, they're really freaked out by it, and because I mean they've seen some messed up stuff, but this kind of takes a cake, and so they look into it, and they find out that these numerical codes that the killer's leaving are in fact Bible scriptures, and so they're looking into these verses and scriptures and everything, and they also find that the blood that's left at the crime scene that says he is coming was in fact lamb's blood. And so there's definitely something going on with the killer in the sense of, say, some sort of religious fixation. And they end up getting assistance from an FBI agent named give me a sec, Agent Wingate, played by Robert Joy. And so he basically works with the police department to try and build a profile of the killer. And Prudhomme is actually kind of a few steps ahead of him in the sense that he because he was the guy who kind of cracked the code, as it were, and figured out that these were in fact Bible verses. He was able to kind of come up with a bit of a profile of his own, but at the same time, Wingate's able to provide some extra information in terms of, say, a psychological makeup on the killer. And so the three of them end up working together, as well as with the police department in general, to try and find out who this killer is and why he's doing this, or he, she, or they are doing this. And it turns out that they ultimately figure out that this serial killer is trying to recreate the body of Jesus Christ, and but he's trying to do so in time for Easter. And so and it turns out that each of the victims that this killer has taken body parts from, each victim is named after a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so with each body part, this killer is making a gruesome masterpiece in his own sick mind. And so it's kind of like a race against time here, because the detectives and the police department, now that they know what the killer's trying to do, they're trying to beat the killer to the punch, before he gets his next victim. And so that's the basic gist of the movie right there. But okay, so my take on the movie is that it's not a bad movie at all. In fact, I mean, I would legitimately say it's a solid movie, but not quite a good movie, though. The main reason being that if you've seen the movie Seven, you can tell that they've taken a lot of inspiration from Seven, and also some of the plot developments and motivations are very similar in some ways to some of the stuff from the movie Seven. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's very similar. And even if you haven't seen the movie Seven, there are some elements in this movie that you can predict, maybe. Although I will admit that, the first time I saw this movie, there were a couple of twists that I was like, whoa, that was actually well done, But that being said, though, some of the stuff here is predictable. And another thing is that the movie takes place in Chicago, but it was actually filmed in Canada. And so, I mean, that in itself isn't a problem. But one of the main problems, I think, though, is that, and once again, we're going back to, the fact that, it's definitely borrowing from Seven, is the fact that a good amount of the time it's raining like cats and dogs, and so so you see that and you're kind of like, okay, I've seen this in a whole bunch of other movies, that kind of thing. And also just the fact that like you get the idea that the whole police department is working on this case, but it takes the lead character, to decode everything as far as the Bible verses and what have you. And so, when you get to that part, you're kind of thinking, well, the numbers and stuff, I mean, that seems like it would be fairly easy for just about anyone in the police department to figure out, but it's, Christopher Lambert's character, he's the only one who's able to put two and two together, and as far as that goes. And so, so I did think that, they made it to where, the lead character or the protagonist, I think if they maybe had it to where he was more of a team player, with fellow detectives and what have you, like if they'd actually shown him working with his fellow detectives and trying to solve the case and put two and two together, if they had been, say, something like you see on Law and Order, where everyone's putting their heads together to come up with clues about things, or figure out the killer's motivation and what have you. I mean, that I think would have been a better touch than, say, just having the main character being the only one who could figure things out. Because I mean, you get to where because of the film's predictable nature, you're kind of a few steps ahead of the main character, but also, to be fair, I mean, the serial killer's motivation is, or his objective is listed in the synopsis of the movie. So I mean, there is that. But yeah, so I guess mainly it's just that the film's the predictable nature of the movie, plus the fact that, I mean, it overly emphasized that this lead detective was the only one who could figure out what was essentially a simple mystery. I mean, as far as the killer's motivation goes, I'm not talking about trying to figure out the killer's identity, the killer's motivation, but yeah, I think those two things were probably the main problem for me. But otherwise, though, I did think that they did a pretty good job of on one hand, developing, the, lead characters. I mean, especially Christopher Lambert and Leland Orser. I mean, they did really good in their parts. I mean, they had, good chemistry as, the two detectives working together, and their different personalities, I thought, provided an interesting little chemistry there, but or contrast, if you will. And Christopher Lambert, I thought, actually did a pretty good job in the part, because he does it well with playing someone who's got a lot of emotional baggage. And I mean, I guess you could say that kind of harkens back to movies like, say, Greystoke or Highlander, because I mean, when you see those movies and something tragic happens, with his characters in those movies, I mean, he does pain and sadness and anger rather well, and the same holds true for Resurrection. And I mean, and I also liked how you see that the case has taken a toll on him, in the sense that when the killers, some of the killer's actions basically imperil some of his friends and loved ones. I mean, you see him get really freaked out and on edge, and Christopher Lambert actually does a pretty good job at that. And there's especially memorable scene where he finds one of the victims right after the killer's gotten a body part, and he sees this poor guy, and basically his whole leg's been chopped off, and he's bleeding out, and Christopher Lambert just he does a good job of portraying his character's terror and panic at the situation, because he's like, oh my god, you're trying to stop the bleeding, but of course with the whole leg being gone, I mean, it's basically kind of hopeless there. But I mean, his acting in that scene, I thought was like, yeah, that was good. That was very intense, But unfortunately, there are a couple of scenes where I think that maybe they could have done a few more takes just to get certain things right, because like there's a scene where he's remembering what happened to his son. And I mean, him losing his son, he and his wife losing their son, that was a really sad bit. I mean, the death of a child, that's never a funny thing or anything like that. So while the flashback itself was kind of hard hitting, there's this weird technique where they did where it's like he was remembering it, but then it would cut to him in the present, and the camera would just kind of like zoom out or zoom in, and he'd just be like, no, or something like that. And this is just him at his house, by himself, remembering it. And you think that it would have been a lot more impactful if he had just been, quiet and sad, or just, maybe have some stuff going on with his face, or, body language. But, him just, sort of randomly saying, no, I mean, it was kind of unintentionally funny, and it sort of detracted from the sadness of the moment, of the memory of him losing his son and what have you. And there were a couple of bits where maybe it was like just like the way he speaks English and what have you, because I mean, he does speak English, but there were a couple of bits where his I guess you could say the way he said something, like it was supposed to be intense, but it sounded kind of unintentionally comical. And so that's where I'm thinking it's kind of like they could have done a few more takes, with maybe some of his lines, or maybe as far as showing his grief at having lost his son, they could have relied more on just body language as opposed to, say, vocalization and what have you. But so aside from those nitpicks, I mean, I thought Christopher Lambert actually did a pretty good job. Leland Orser, he was kind of the scene stealer for me, because I remember him as, that dude from Alien Resurrection who ends up, having an alien burst out of his chest, but into the face of another guy, that's the first thing I saw him in, so I'm always remember him, chest burster dude, but I've seen him in some other stuff too. I mean, Taken, and several other things, but I mean, he's a good actor, but this was, I think, my first time seeing him in a role that, like it was essentially comic relief, albeit in a very dark movie. And so it was interesting seeing him, play this sort of inept jokester in a sense that he keeps on coming up with these really bad jokes. But then as he gets more and more into the case and it becomes more and more twisted, I mean, he does a good job of showing his character, getting more and more disturbed and freaked out. I mean, especially, in this one especially gruesome crime scene that, they come across. I mean, he just, freaks out and he's all like, what the F is going on here? I mean, I have never seen anything like this, and the fear and the confusion, that he portrays, in moments like that, it was kind of like, damn, he's actually pretty good. I mean, very versatile. I mean, he goes from, comical to downright, terrified. And so, yeah, this was definitely kind of a revelation for me because I knew Leland Orser was a good actor, but, this is my first time seeing him go, being able to, portray, such different, extremes of emotion, I guess you could say. But also, Robert Joy, I thought, was actually pretty good too. I mean, there is that sort of jurisdictional friction in a sense that, he's an FBI agent, and Christopher Lambert and Leland Orser are playing, just, plain Jane detectives. And so there's a bit of jurisdictional, I guess you could say, friction. And there are times where his character kind of comes across as condescending, but somewhere along the way, he and Christopher Lambert's characters, they sort of end up, forming a rapport with one another. And so it was interesting seeing Robert Joy, play that kind of part. But there was a casting choice that was very surprising, and that was the film director David Cronenberg playing a priest. And so his character was the priest at the church that Prudhomme and his wife attended. And because of the loss of their son, I mean, Prudhomme hasn't, been to church in a long time. And so, David Cronenberg's character, Father Rossell, on behalf of Prudhomme's, wife, I mean, he comes to, check in on Prudhomme and see how he's doing, because, he's concerned about him because, I mean, this is a guy who was attending church and now he's not attending church and he works a pretty stressful job and, obviously he wants to, make sure he's doing okay, both emotionally and spiritually. And so it was interesting seeing David Cronenberg play that kind of role because the one other thing I'd seen him in as far as acting was the movie Nightbreed, and he was a pretty good bad guy in that movie. So, I wouldn't blame anyone who saw the Nightbreed and then saw this movie for the first time, thinking that Cronenberg's character is going to be the killer, So, but I mean there are some other familiar faces though. I mean, you got Barbara Tyson as Sarah, John's wife, Christopher Lambert's character's wife, and she, I thought she did a nice job, with what she had to work with as far as playing the wife of a man who's on edge, because he's having to go between a horrifying case, plus he's coping with the memory of having lost their son, but she comes across as someone who's trying to move on, if not outright forget the loss of her son, obviously, but just, she's trying to press forward, and, she's relying on her faith to, help her, get through things, and she's wanting to, be able to work together with her husband to get through things, but, she's in a spot where she's kind of alone, so you kind of feel sorry for her character. But you also see former basketball player Rick Fox as one of the detectives, and he was actually pretty good too. And there's a bit where when they do catch the killer initially, there's this bit where he's pretty pissed off, and disgusted at this guy because of, these gruesome crime scenes and everything, and it's basically got, Chicago all freaked out. But, Rick Fox's character, when he's arresting him, reading him his rights, he's like, "You have the right to remain silent, mother," MF'er, right? And so, I mean, so he actually did, pretty good too. But I thought that was a funny little, bit there. I mean, I don't know if it would have, held up in court as far as, throwing MF'er at the end of your Miranda rights being read, but I mean, it's still, it was kind of like well deserved, and you definitely, that character, the killer definitely had that coming at least. But yeah, so I mean, all in all, I mean, it's got a good cast. And I will say that the twist of the killer's identity, that was actually pretty good. So while the movie is predictable in terms of, say, the motivations and everything, and other elements, the twist in regards to who the killer is, that was very well done. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was kind of like, what? And so even though I knew who the killer was the second time around, the development, the lead up, and I guess you could say the build up to it, was still well done enough to where it was like, I know how this is going to end, but at the same time, I appreciate, how they did it, but I mean, of course, I don't want to say who the killer is because, I mean, in case you haven't seen the movie, but that was a nice little twist, though, as far as, the killer's identity and what have you. So even though the motivation's predictable, the identity was not, at least, the first time around. And also the makeup and gore effects. I mean, my God, I mean, they did a really good job in terms of, say, showing, the just the carnage of, the crime scenes and what have you. And even more so when, say, they come across someone who's either, dying or has only recently been killed. But it's like, it really looks like someone has only recently, had a body part chopped off, and, their body's, reacting accordingly and what have you. Or if they find, a body that's, been in the ground or decomposing for several days. I mean, they did a really good job of, I guess you could say, creating, the dead bodies, or, applying the makeup and prosthetics and what have you. Because, I mean, this is some pretty sick stuff. So if you have a weak stomach, you might want to pass on this movie. But, blood and gore, and I mean, I like horror movies, okay? So blood and gore, I'm no stranger to blood and gore. But there were moments, though, where, there were certain visuals in this movie where I'm kind of like, damn, I mean, just because of, how realistic, the blood and gore was in terms of, say, the crime scenes and the dead bodies and what have you. And especially that scene where, Prudhomme, finds that one victim who's bleeding out. I mean, that was pretty nasty, But, sorry. Anyway, though, so yeah, all in all, though, this was actually a decent movie. not a bad movie at all. Just unfortunately, though, its predictable nature does keep it from being a good movie, at least in my opinion. But I'm going to go ahead and give Resurrection 3 out of 5 stars. Not quite a good movie, but at the same time, it's done well enough to where it's worth watching at least once if you haven't seen it. And if you're a Russell Mulcahy fan or a Christopher Lambert fan, or just, a fan of serial killer movies in general, I mean, I would say it's worth buying. And also, if you're into, say, like special features and what have you, the Blu-ray, the special features it has are, let's see, A Cathartic Experience, an interview with director Russell Mulcahy, and it's actually a pretty informative interview. And so, from what I remember of the commentary on the DVD, a lot of the same information is covered, except in this case, this is an interview that was more recent, seeing as how, it was from 2021. And so it's definitely intriguing, seeing, the director of the movie, in this sort of, I guess you could say, Zoom call or interview, talking about the movie and reminiscing and what have you. And, Russell Mulcahy, I mean, in the commentaries I've, listened to with him, or the interviews I've listened to with him, I mean, he always has good stories to tell and all sorts of insights into, how the movie was made and what have you. He even makes a shadow joke, because he directed the movie The Shadow, and so I thought that was actually a nice little touch there. So yeah, that was actually a pretty good interview, because some of this information you're able to find online, or if you've listened to the commentary on the DVD release, I mean, some of this information's already covered, but there's also some new stuff that you find out. But, because, Russell Mulcahy is a good listen, I mean, you're gonna, probably appreciate hearing about, the movie from the director of the movie. And you also have, let's see, A Cathartic Experience, an interview, actually, no, sorry, Terrifying or Hilarious, an interview with actor Robert Joy. And so, Robert Joy in this interview, he talks a little bit about how he got started in acting, and, some of the movies that he's been in that he's more well known for. And I didn't know a whole lot about him. Like, I'd seen him in some stuff, but I didn't know about his background. So it's definitely intriguing in that regard, seeing, how he got started and everything. And when he talks about this movie, you get some interesting things in the sense that there are some parts in the movie that he feels like they did a good job with, in terms of, say, making things disturbing or horrifying, but then there were other moments where it's kind of like they tried to go for horror but ended up being more funny than scary. And considering some of the quibbles I had with the movie, I can kind of I see where he's coming from in that regard, and to some extent I would agree with him. But no, he did enjoy working on the movie, though. It's just, there were bits where, he's like, he felt like some of the, disturbing stuff, worked, whereas some of the other stuff he feels like, yeah, they were trying too hard, that kind of thing. But still, I mean, it's a good interview. Then you have, let's see, On the Same Page, an interview with actor Jonathan Potts. And so Jonathan Potts plays one of the detectives in the movie, and I may have seen him in some other movies, and he seems to be like a kind of a character actor, but he also talks about how he got started, and then of course he talks about his experience in working on this movie, and he talks about how he was a huge fan of the movie Highlander, and so when he found out that he got the part for one of the detectives in a movie starring Christopher Lambert, who was Highlander, directed by the guy who made Highlander, he was basically kind of a huge fanboy about the whole thing, you know, and he's calling all his friends and say, "Guys, guess what? I'm in the movie with Highlander, man." So I mean, so it was pretty funny, you know, hearing him, you know, talk about, you know, basically just reminiscing about, you know, how, you know, excited he was to, you know, basically work with one of, you know, his favorite actors who played one of his favorite characters, you know. And, you know, he's very complimentary of Christopher Lambert, and, you know, talking about, you know, how, you know, focused he was, and, you know, what have you. And also there was a scene, you know, towards the climax of the movie, where something happens to his character, like he gets injured, and he talks about, you know, why that happened with his character, and it turns out it had to do with run time. Like they were trying to find a way to say increase, you know, the run time of the movie, because otherwise, you know, it was going to be, you know, too short. And so, you know, I thought that was an interesting little story there. But let's see. The other special feature, though, is Over the Top, an interview with composer Jim McGrath. And so Jim McGrath, I mean, you know, he actually does a pretty good, you know, score for the movie, you know, which, you know, it kind of made me think of the score for the movie Hellraiser Inferno, in the sense that, you know, there seemed to be kind of like a, you know, a almost choral element to it at times, and then of course you had kind of a more instrumental, you know, beat, you know, to it in some of the scenes. And so, you know, hearing him talk about, you know, working on the movie, you know, he said that it's one of the scores that, you know, he's, you know, proud of, and, you know, people still, you know, talk to him about it or compliment him about it, and, you know, he's really happy about that. And so, I mean, there are a couple of moments in the movie where I felt like the music score was, you know, too, shall I say, you know, I don't know, like you see it maybe like a TV show, like, say, you know, CSI or something like that. And granted, this was before CSI, but, you know, I felt like, you know, it was very derivative. I don't know if derivative is the right word, but it felt like, I don't know, formulaic as far as, you know, the type of score he had for some of the scenes, whereas some of the other, you know, parts of the movie, the score worked rather well, because I guess, you know, he was able to, you know, use instrumentation to convey a sense of dread or, you know, tragedy and what have you. And in those moments, I thought the score was actually pretty good. But, you know, hearing him talk about it, you know, was actually, you know, pretty interesting. I mean, I'm not a musician, so some of the terminology I'm not familiar with, but at the same time, you know, hearing about, you know, how the score came to be, you know, was a nice touch. And, you know, it's nice to hear that, you know, it's a score that he's still proud of. But, okay, so there was one thing I forgot where I wanted to touch on. Okay, so when you find out what the killer's motivation is, you know, it's, you know, trying to recreate the body of Jesus Christ. I mean, you can kind of see it coming, but there is a scene when the detectives and, you know, and you know, a bunch of police officers, you know, find, you know, the killer's lair, where, you know, he's got this body assembled, and yeah, it's pretty sick. I mean that in a good way and a bad way. It's good in the sense that, you know, it's a very good, you know, makeup and prosthetic job, you know, but it's also sick in a sense that it's genuinely like, oh my God, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, like, even though you already know what the killer's motivation is, when you see, you know, his progress, if you will, I mean, that was pretty nasty. But also, it definitely, you know, worked, you know, with the horror element. But there were a couple of things that I thought that they could have done differently as far as, you know, the killer goes, as far as, say, like, his motivation, or at least his mindset, you know, because, there are some nice visual moments in terms of, say, camera work and what have you, but I felt like, especially with, say, a director as, skilled with, visual flair as Russell Mulcahy is, I mean, you see a movie like, say, Razorback, and you got that memorable dream sequence where, the main character's, basically dehydrated and hallucinating, and, that he's walking through this, alien landscape almost. And I felt like they could have done something like that with this movie in terms of, say, maybe having a couple of scenes where, you see just how unhinged the killer is internally. I mean, you already know the killer's messed up, but, seeing what's going on in the killer's mind, like, it would have been really, cool if, especially from a horror standpoint, maybe if we'd gotten to see a couple of scenes from the killer's perspective where, maybe he's seeing this, ghostly image of Jesus Christ, albeit maybe covered in blood, giving him orders or something like that, or just, reaching out to him, like maybe, the assembled body parts, coming together and reaching out to him and calling out for him or something like that. I mean, see, that would have been a nice touch, I think. And I think, with, like I said, with, someone as visually, skilled as Russell Mulcahy is, I think that, in terms of, say, how he's able to work with cinematographers and everything, I mean, they could have pulled something like that off, and it would have elevated the movie immensely, I think, to a point where, I mean, yeah, it's still predictable in some ways, but it would have been, say, elevated to something that was actually good, because that would have been something original. You're seeing something from a special effects standpoint, conveying the mindset of the serial killer, and it would have aided in terms of, say, emphasizing the horror of the movie. But unfortunately, they didn't do that. But it just, it's one of those things that you think about, especially if you're into horror and what have you, and you see a movie like this, and you're like, that would have been awesome to see. Disturbing, but awesome. So, missed opportunity. That being said, though, the disturbing stuff we do see, it is disturbing. So even though the movie's predictable, there's enough going for it to where, I mean, it's definitely worth checking out. And like I said, I mean, if you're a Russell Mulcahy, Christopher Lambert fan, or just, a fan of serial killer movies in general, Resurrection, I would say, is worth having. Just bear in mind, it's not, I wouldn't say it's one of the greats by any means, and it sadly does fall short of being good, but it's well done enough to where it's a worthwhile movie. So, Resurrection, 3 stars out of 5. So, yeah, that was my take on it. Thanks for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all take care. Good night. Bye.